So our next speaker is Carlos Alpuerto. I've spent a bit of time talking to him, impressed with his knowledge. Carlos has been defending cybersecurity since 2001, and for some perspective, that's when the first Shrek movie came out. Carlos is a digital IT professional with a deep expertise in cybersecurity, infrastructure, and enterprise software. He's held leadership positions in disaster recovery, automations, and served as a subject matter expert for IBM. He specializes in SWORD technology. Today at ThreatX, recently acquired by A10 Networks, he helps organizations fight off advanced layer 7 DDoS attacks with bot traffic. So if you ever wonder who's protecting the internet on top of hackers and bots, it's people like Carlos. Please help me welcome Carlos Alpuerto.
And thank you, Joseph. Let's see if this works. There we go. And we're going to notice something as soon as this gets to our first landing side here. There are 3 names on the board. I got called in to pinch hit, so if anything, we're going to have fun with this, speak as raw as I can. After reviewing some of the slides, I am going to argue against some of the slides that I've been given as well. So we are definitely going to have fun. If anything, I'm the child of the 70s and 80s, so I speak in one-liners, sarcasm, and movie quotes. If anybody wants to call me out on those, I got little prizes for those as well. But let's get to it. All right, so DDoS is dead, long live DDoS. And why do I say that? When we think of the web applications that we support, it's not necessarily about SYNAC floods anymore. Oftentimes, and a majority of the DDoS attacks that we receive are in the form of something at the layer 7 OSI level. So when we think of HTTP floods, yes, it is still volumetric in nature, not quite the same degree that a SYNAC flood would be, but why are they more difficult to track down? Why are they more difficult to isolate? Because they're effectively real requests. They are good gets, posts, whatever they might be, and as such, they tie up resources. But layer 7 is much more nuanced than that. With regards to a denial of service, it doesn't necessarily have to be distributed. That can be conducted by a single system. A slow rate attack, a slow read attack, right? Those, for those that are unfamiliar with it, if you think of a probing or reconnaissance that a good attacker would do, they're going to find out what is in your environment. They're going to probe different endpoints, URIs, things of that nature. But they're also going to look at your timeouts. And with a good slow rate attack, let's say my timeout period is 30 seconds, a slow rate will send me an HTTP request, partially, and in 28 seconds before that timeout period, they're going to send the next part of that HTTP request and carry that on, keeping that session open and eventually filling up open sessions, right? Very much like we have 12 doors in this room. If all of those doors are tied up, waiting for things to happen, nobody's getting in, nobody's getting out. Those applications are being DDoSed. So, reiterating what I had stated here, oftentimes this is now carried on by botnets and bots within the environment, not just necessarily individuals. This next slide, and I'm going to fast forward this a little bit, is going to be my first argument against slides that were given. Come on. Right, the statement here is regex WAF is dead. I don't believe that, right? For those of us that have ever done a martial art or played a game where you have a defensive strategy, you don't just say, I'm going to stop blocking, or I'm going to stop preventing attacks that I know the pattern to. You're going to leverage a signature that you are aware of. And as such, you're going to want to prevent that. But because of AI, because of various automations, yes, you're going to want to have additional capabilities to protect against that. But if you can block out the initial attacks that you are already aware of, please, let's go ahead and do so. Now this next one, once it comes up, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the statement here, WAFs don't stop API attacks. True, untrue, right? People would argue that APIs are called by way of HTTP, and as such, a WAF should be able to protect against it to a degree, right? When we think of how a BOLA attack, broken object level authorization, works, if you're unfamiliar with it, if you're maybe familiar with IDOR, right? Insecure Direct Object Reference, kind of the same thing, so you're already ahead of the curve, but effectively think of getting through with a proper set of credentials, and then within your GET request, your POST request, you are switching IDs. It's a very sophisticated way, taking advantage of vulnerabilities to be able to get past security measures. But unlike an API solution that might leverage behavioral tracking, your general WAF is not going to be able to protect against that because it is a proper request. It just happens to be shifting within there. Now this animation that's associated to this addresses the API security isn't statement that's up there. It's also applicable to SIM technology and SOAR technology from that. And what do we mean by this? When we think of the various vendors that are in that exhibit hall, oftentimes we hear API security. API security is a very thrown about term. It can be applicable to so many different variations in how you want to apply security, as opposed to just being API protective, API vulnerability detective, API identification, right? These are all different pillars to API security. So what this video is doing over and over again is exactly what the various visibility tools would give us, right? This is what our SIMs are doing. This is why we are up at night. We are getting attacked, and we are being notified by our cameras, our SIMs, that we've been attacked, right? Sometimes the box might be left. That's our false positives. But oftentimes, the box is taken. And how is this security from a protective standpoint? It is not. The attack has happened. You've been victimized. Now you have to respond. Incident response, right? So enter the SOAR solutions. But the SOAR solutions, I used to work for a SOAR vendor, by the way. It's very difficult to implement and integrate with your other technologies. But given that, we've identified a number of different things here. I have a vulnerability. My porch, my application, is open to attack. I've identified the bandits in this case, but oftentimes it's not about who the attacker is, that entity. It's about the attack that was done, the theft that happened within here. So SANS 101, right, when you think of the last step in the incident response, it's about lessons learned. Hopefully, you would patch this vulnerability and you would put up some type of blockade to that porch area. But oftentimes, that's not the case. Oftentimes, I'm dealing with the next one, or I'm dealing with the guy at the back door, or the ones coming in through the windows, or the one who thinks he's Santa Claus and rather than come in with a full sack and leave with an empty one, comes in with an empty one, leaves with a full one. Right? But let's say we did do a patch to this vulnerability. I put up a screen door. Okay, what's to prevent the person who's supposed to drop off and interact with that porch from coming in and doing so, right? Now we have authorization problems associated to that. So there's a lot of nuance that can be taken out of this, and as such, we have to apply a solution that does a protective measure but learns from all of the technologies all at once. All right. And the machine war has begun. think of the evolution of our, not only security world, but the technical world with which we live. Digital transformation, right? I go back far enough to have worked with EDI. For some of the younger faces, it's, what is that? For some of us that know what EDI is, you think, oh, he's been around a little while, right? First, introduction to integrated or systems that talk to each other. Bigger transformations happened in the 2010s, and then what happened? COVID, right? COVID forced a lot of more interactions and integrated technologies to become what they are now. It forced us to have a way to be able to work from remote locations, home or otherwise, because we can't always be in office, right? For anybody in our, any of our OT brothers or sisters that might be in the room, yes, we think we're in a air-gapped environment and we're isolated from the world. Not always the case. There are plenty of studies online that show exposed APIs addressing your ICS, your PLCs, your DCS solutions within there, the SCADA, right? Or even the HMIs, the human-machine interfaces. A lot of those are leveraging APIs that you might not yet know are exposed to that outside world. You can use various solutions that are available online to scour the environments. I hope we're doing that level of identification and attack surface management, vulnerability management associated to that. But with the inclusion now of AI, which just makes it that much more pervasive within the environment, it just makes it that much harder for us to keep up because AI is that much faster than we are. And I think I need to build this one out. This slide I hate, right? This is a censored version of what was supposed to have been Cardi B, and if you don't know the acronym, I'm not going to tell you here, or at least not on stage. But think of what often happens, right? The technology and terms get thrown about. WAP, in my world, web application API protection, oftentimes came in hardware, right? Whether it was WAF first and we realized we had more APIs than just general web application communications, and then they moved it to the cloud because things were getting cloud diversified, and that has given us a little bit of advantage in the event of DDoS because we are now proxying the attacks and we are buffering rather than having that information hit our origin hosts and internal network. And then the CNAP, right? Cloud Native Application Protection. But even though protection is in the name, and I don't want to, stomp on any of those particular vendors, there is a level of security in there. There is vulnerability management, and there is runtime security often with CNAP solutions. But runtime security is watching the commands or the execution of attacks happen at that particular shell level. So when you think of that, that's also incident response. Something we should be aware of. So mind the gap. There have been a number of talks today talking about tool expansion and more tools, right? But what are we really addressing? Are we addressing the various problems, or are we protecting the one item, our applications and our origin hosts, from the various problems, right? It's a different way to think of the issues that we should be addressing. And then oftentimes, it is about stacking tools together. And it might be by way of mergers and acquisitions, whether a WAF solution acquires API protection, acquires layer 7 DDoS, acquires bot protection, and then they amalgamate all of this into a Frankenstein's management console. That management console, yes, gives you that single pane of glass, but it's still separated technology. You click on different screens to manage that solution, and those technologies are still not necessarily talking to each other. They should. and they should be learning from each other so that you can apply an appropriate level of protection. When you think of attacking APIs, I talked about the scanning, the reconnaissance that happens within there, the probing of what's in the environment, what are your timeouts, and then additional attacks for credential stuffing or password spraying, finding out how we can get in or get past certain capabilities. It might be used for fraud, absolutely, but when we think of that BOLA attack that I had mentioned, it is about being able to get past initial sets of security measures so that you can run these scripts based on potential vulnerabilities that might be there. You know, if you run a good attack this way, if there is good prevention of this, then, right, they'll get the errors. But these solutions should be talking to each other so that you can come full circle, right? Much like SDLC learns from its own experience, we should be applying the same within security, right? Understand your attack surface, understand the vulnerabilities associated to it, and then apply protections to there. Going back to that video and the analogy to SIM technology, if we're not applying the lessons that we've learned, then, or even if you consider the rules or the alerts that you create within a SIM, you already know what it is you're looking for. Why not apply it to a protective solution? It minimizes the amount of noise you have to deal with. In the end, you get to sleep a little bit better at night, but you get to focus on the next item as opposed to constantly dealing with the same item over and over again. Come on.
Hello? Hello? Yes, this is Joseph.
Yeah.
Sure.
Again, disconnected alerts, false positives, chasing our tails with these.
Do you have a position in mind?
And then the resources, right? Oftentimes when we think of the security teams being overwhelmed, what do? If we don't have enough staff on our own, we hire an MDR or an XDR, whatever they want to call themselves, an MSSP, because we just don't have the manpower to do it. And why is that? Because oftentimes those same service providers are taking the talent that we need, right? But do they know our environments? Are they able to work with the solutions that we already have in place, or do we have to adopt what it is that they have, right? Migration of solutions is not easy either.
You should have it on my email address.
So enter this concept of hacker mind that, you know, came about with ThreatX some time ago as our threat analysis engine.
It's Joseph.
And how does that put it all together?
KOLE@gmail.com.
This. Also an analogy I don't like, you know, everyone likes to think of the One Ring as managing it together. It's a management console in this case, right? For those of you that know the lore, you have to wear the rings in order to be controlled by them. If you're not, well, then you're not being controlled. So that One Ring is really just a management console for those solutions that are online. I like to think of it more as Voltron, right? 5 mini robots combining into one super robot, and they are actually working as one system, right? They all know from each other, they all learn from each other, and they allow us to make use of that technology and that capability. But time, the problem. Oftentimes, think about how much time you've spent dealing with an alert, chasing it down, doing the triage to find out, nah, not a big deal, right? And then you got to move on to the next, and then the next after that. When you do find something, yay, we, you know, celebrate for a little while, but now we get to work. But that time that is spent in there, we're chasing phantoms, right? We want to make sure that we can address these things a lot faster, get them out of the way. That's why solutions, who's out there? AirMDR is one of them, automation and application of AI to detection and response, being able to address these things faster, narrow your focus to what is a true alert that you want to work with. So why waste your time there? So what's the solution? Integrating all of that technology together. Now, as you know, for those that were here at the beginning, if you saw, and I'm just going to build this out, Jameson was a name that was on there. He is not here, so I am going to poke fun just a little bit. Come on. We started off with Cardi B and WAF in this case. Jameson from my team deals with that as well, but Jameson is also a whiskey, right? From whiskey, you can get spirits. Jameson's associated to cybersecurity. There are two things that are tied there together. Jameson also does music. He's a guitarist with a band. But does that all that make sense? Does that those terms all fit into each other, right? By approaching this from a human perspective and understanding what is applicable, we can now address these things and understand where the gaps are and what needs to be filled. So this is the shameless plug, right? Having a team there that's available to help you cobble these together, make sure that the information that you have on hand is there to help you use the solutions that you have. I've been there on the operations side many moons ago. Calling a help desk that isn't available is not a fun thing, right? If your vendors aren't there to help you, seek something better. There's another slide I don't necessarily agree with. It's not more money, more problems. It's less money, more problems. All of us are being asked to do less with more. No, scratch that, reverse it. We're being asked to do more with less, right? The purse holders, the budgets, they're not being put out there for us to implement solutions that we know we need. Come on. Oh boy, okay. So yes, when we think of protecting our web applications, we do have to consider the various attacks and types that they that come at it, where they might come from, how they are applied, right? When we think of the API protection and the WAF functionality, those are almost part and parcel. But DDoS, why is DDoS there? Historically, it was there to cause chaos, right? Movie quote, some men just want to watch the world burn. But nowadays, it's often a cover-up, either for monetary gain or monetary loss, right? Make a company's bottom dollar go down because their sites are no longer available. But for subterfuge and being able to hide attacks, oftentimes it is the distraction that we need to address because the actual attacks are way down here. It's the subtle attack that we don't notice because we're addressing this, perceived major attack that is happening because the website is down, when in the fact, not only is it down, we're losing data on the other side of this. So again, not the Lord of the Rings, but our Voltron, have one application that can use all of that information all at once, feed into one database so that you can see the entities that are not only probing the environment, they are also the ones potentially issuing the DDoS attacks that are issuing the other attacks. And in this case, the goal is to be able to take out the attacker, right? We are all focused on doing the protection of the individual attacks, right? Again, I'll bring up the self-defense analogy. You can block all the punches and kicks that you want, but if you can take out the attacker themselves, you no longer have to worry about the punches and kicks. Right, so being able to apply all of that knowledge together in one solution is the best approach to it. Oftentimes, this is us dealing with other alerts. Even without addressing the false positives, because of AI, because of botnets, the sheer volume of attacks that come at us, even the true positives, are such that we don't get to implement the lessons learned. We learned, but we're so busy addressing everything else that we can't have time, or we don't have time to address that. So just being inundated with attacks is not a fun way to be. Again, take out the attacker, don't worry about the individual attacks or the multiple attacks that they can issue. Yep, so that dog and the amount of attacks or fun things, quote unquote, that they are dealing with, right? Narrow it down to one. Be able to address things appropriately as necessary. And then the risks, right? Who's responsible for what? Again, tie the solutions together. Don't address here without missing there or that spot, right? If you can't address the layer 7 DDoS and protect against that, what makes you think that the WAF can be there? And also the application to that, right? I talked about the cloud WAPs or cloud functionality that's in place. It's very purposeful, right? The scalability of cloud allows us to address something like a DDoS attack, because now those proxied sensors can grow, right? Dynamic scaling, something that's available within AWS and various other solutions, allow us to increase the amount of available sensors such that the impact is absorbed there and doesn't have to be felt on the other side, while at the same time providing protective measures for WAF. But again, going back to that BOLA, if I understand that an offensive entity, right, it's not even a user, right, just like UBA became UEBA, but if I can identify that an entity has done the reconnaissance, has done the password spraying and the credential stuffing, has done everything that they can, I can catch them and block them as part of a prelude to the real attack. Right, that BOLA that I had mentioned, or anything associated to that, where in which a signature is very unlikely to be created, and there's no way to identify that outright. So a unification of products, again, we will always have defense in depth. We will always require multiple products. However, they should be products purchased for specific usage for what it is you are trying to protect. If you're trying to protect the same thing, your application hosts, applications, origin hosts, whatever, by cobbling together various solutions, look for something that's unified, right? That can learn from itself, that can make use of that information and address it as necessary. I think that is the last, right? Our goal to futurize it, make sure that we are working as one, united, and simplify that. We don't need these huge, colorful dashboards. We want technology that works within. Again, apologize if this is a little raw. I was called in as a pinch hitter, but happy to talk to any of the conversations, anything you might be dealing with for your applications as well, or OT environments that might be publicly facing as necessary. Questions? Cool. I think we're good. Oh, yes, sir.
Can you speak? All right.
How would you envision the architecture of that looking? I hear everybody always talking about these layered approaches or having multiple things, but we always get a tremendous amount of pushback for performance and other issues if I have, say, web traffic passing through 7 or 8 different inspection points, right? So how do you envision, it's nice to say, hey, let's all play together or send the best of breed to do the jobs, but it's getting a WAF inserted between the customer and the end and the server is one thing, but then saying I might need 4, right?
Yeah,
how does that work, or how do you see that working?
So I tried to do this presentation without doing product pitch. Now I'm going to do the product pitch. We provide that functionality in an all-in-one sensor. So rather than pass multiple inspection points, all of those inspections happen within the one sensor. So looking at it from an outside-in perspective, what is within the HTTP requests such that it might be indicative of attack nature? Is there a volumetric or non-volumetric DDoS that is happening at the sensor where it's being absorbed and we're buffering the requests so that we're not passing incomplete requests, so that if we need to, we can scale up to increase the sensor count and allow for more traffic to pass through while continuing to absorb the brunt of what might be a volumetric attack. But at the same time, leverage all of that information that I had mentioned previously to say, this entity is doing all of this suspicious behavior, increasing their risk score. Once they reach a threshold, we can take out that entity without having to worry about the attacks we may or may not miss.
So maybe, it certainly was not shilling for you or getting you to promote whatever, but I think what you're kind of speaking to is less of maybe what I was thinking you were talking about, which is you're just saying find a better product. You're not necessarily saying that there's a way to kind of pull a best of breed or some other approach. It would be, you're still kind of talking about what I'm assuming is a cloud-based sensor, but you're just adding more smarts to it. So it's not so much go find other things to fill the holes, or as you were speaking to earlier, various different ways to approach the security. You're just saying we've built a better mousetrap, so you should use us.
Well, yes and no. So you're absolutely right? To that effect, yes, we do have something that, of course, I'd love to promote it. It's my day job. It comes as cloud or on-prem sensors. However, that was to address the question of latency. For some of us, latency isn't quite as important, and I'm not going to say it's not, but it's not quite as important where we need ultra-low latency, right, that ULL, and as such, having a daisy chain of solutions that can apply the appropriate protections is the way to go. And if you can use that information by sending logs, information to a SIM wherein it can be centralized and put together, and then as such, those alerts and things that you've addressed can be applied to additional rules, that is the way to go, right? But again, in light of not having the ability to tolerate latency, having a unified solution is the better.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I think it's maybe when we ship things off, then it becomes asynchronous and it becomes not kind of the bottlenecking where it's I need to inspect it before I allow it, which you're also talking about is an architecture where some things might be real time or might be in line, and some things might be an analysis later and then a rule update or applied, right? So
yes.
Yeah, so no, and I get that, and I mean certainly would make those kind of decisions. I was just kind of curious again because that seems to be the challenge of the more things we put block and tackling in line, it's certainly better for not letting those things slip through and then finding them in the logs later. But it also means you're increasing the latency depending on how much compute has to go into. I mean, it can be small, but again, every time everything adds up. And when you have folks that are certainly getting nervous about things not being snappy and responsive, I think that's the balance act that we're doing. So, okay, good.
Of course.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and you know, to take that a step further, if it's all cloud-based and web technology, now you have to include the latency for internet hops, right, wherever they're hosted and their POPs are. Cool, thank you. Yes, sir.
So for me, this makes a lot more sense in like a legacy, you know, kind of environment where you have, you know, static, you know, web servers that are hosting something, and you're, you know, you have a straightforward, you know, WAF to, you know, front end, you know, kind of setup. What I'm in our company is trying to wrap our heads around is, you know, how do we approach that from a, you know, distributed cloud environment? Like, you know, you've got Azure and AWS clouds out there, and everything, you know, potentially has, you know, a door out to the internet, you know, sitting right there. You know, we're trying to, you know, from a WAF perspective, you can either approach that and, you know, give every single resource, you know, a WAF, you know, and have it do that, or you can approach it from like the Cloudflare perspective of, you know, have your DNS do the WAF, you know, and provide that kind of scenario. What are your thoughts on the best way of trying to integrate WAF into that kind of, you know, distributed environment?
Yeah, it's the same way that I would approach the DDoS by leveraging a reverse proxy in that scenario, because then you can just direct traffic to the IPs if you're going to use A records, or to the, you know, FQDNs of a load balancer that might be able to further distribute the traffic as necessary. But by doing so, you can have a central solution, right? So AWS, you might be in US East 1, and Azure, you might be in a relatively similar location. Cool, you can leverage a single sensor. It depends on the site settings such that you can proxy to the appropriate destination. But the other benefit of that proxy is such that, you know, when you think of the DDoS, if it is cloud-based, or if it is in a VMware environment that is set to scale dynamically, then that too can absorb, not necessarily by way of rules and protection and block, right? DDoS, if you block it, they're just going to come at you again and again and again. If, however, you can buffer the requests, because it might be a slow rate attack, and then proxy it as it comes in, but absorb the impact at that sensor, that dynamically scaling capability allows it to grow, right? That's where hardware WAFs fall down in that ability, because you can't add more memory on the spot, but you can grow out a virtualized environment. And by being reverse proxy, allows you to point in various directions. Cool. Thank you.